Let me thank you in advance. Our scripture today, Genesis 23, verses 1 through 4. If you have the King James Version, you'll find these holy, divine, and inspired words. And Sarah was 107 and 20 years old. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died in Kirjath Arba, the same is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And Abraham stood up from before his dead and spake unto the sons of Heth, saying, I am a stranger and a sojourner with you. Give me a possession of a burying place with you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. The word of God. As we continue, my brothers and my sisters, our awesome series, which has come into a completion. I believe there's 2 more sermons left dealing with embracing the God-filled life. On today, Sister Belinda, we want to talk from the thought, from the subject, from those verses, chapter 23, verses 1 through 4. We want to talk from the subject, if you will, mourn everything hopefully. Mourn everything hopefully. King Solomon, I'm sure you've heard about him, was a man considered by God to be the wisest man to have ever lived. And Mike Campbell, God put so much wisdom in him that he did not only say that you will be the wisest of your generation, he said, I'm going to put wisdom in you, Solomon, that there was never a man like you before, and there won't be one after you die. Bonner, he's considered as the wisest man to ever live. And in that wisdom, in Ecclesiastes, Sean Gibson, chapter 7, verse 1, he made a statement. King Solomon said, a good name is better than precious ointment. He said a good name is better than precious ointment. And we know about names in some point, because at some point you tell your kids that, okay, now you got my last name. There's some things, Dre, you're not going to do because you possess my name. I don't care what name you have on your back. I don't care what jersey you wear. The actions that come out of you eventually comes back to this house. So I don't care about society. You better act like what your last name is. So he says that a good name is better than precious ointment. And then he says something that may have threw us for a loop. Then he said in the same sentence, and the day of death better than the day of birth. Now that's when we go, wait a minute, Mr. Wise Man. I'm okay with the good name thing, but you said the day of death is better than the day of one's birth. Notice what Solomon did not say. He did not say that death is better than life. For obviously you can't die unless you've been born. But Solomon's point, Geraldine, was that the name given to you at birth is like a fragrant ointment. And you must keep it that way until you die. So if somebody messed the name up, it ain't going to be you. See, the name you received at birth, nobody knew what you would make out of it. And hopefully we want to live up to our names depending on what your name is. And that's why we need to be careful about naming children. And thank God my parents, they named me Timothy. And obviously Timothy means honoring God. And I got to live every day to live up to that name. Now, again, it's up to you what to name your kids, and it doesn't obviously have to be anything biblical, but make sure you check the record and don't name them anything or anybody that was cursed, because they just might live up to that name. Now, at death, that name that they gave you, that name is either going to be fragrant or it's either going to be putrid. That name that they gave you, Edward, at death, it's either going to be sweet or it's either going to be sour. And who determines whether it's sour is sweet is the actions that follow and that's in between your name. So today we look at this lady by the name of Sarah. Without a doubt, Sarah is the most important woman in the Old Testament. Not as it relates to value, but as it relates to vision and the ancestry concerning Jesus Christ. She was the womb, if you will, that they all came out of. Now, when I say Sarah was the most important person in the Old Testament, that's saying something because we know that there were some very powerful, important people by now in the Old Testament. Okay? You remember Ruth. Ruth is right over here. Ruth, the Moabitess. Ruth ended up being the great-grandmother of King David, and she was an ancestor in the line of the Messiah. It was Ruth who gave us that great poetic verse who said, entreat me not to leave you, nor from following after you. She said, for where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. My God, your God will be my God. Where you dwell, I will dwell. Where you be buried, that's where they're going to bury me. So Ruth was an awesome person in the Old Testament, but Ruth, she doesn't measure up to Sarah as it relates to important people in the Old Testament. Okay? Hannah was an excellent lady in the Old Testament. Hannah, remember, prayed for a man-child, and she said, Lord, if you give me this child, she said, no razor will come upon his head. I will sanctify him. In other words, I'll give him the Nazirite vow if you just bless me with a man-child. And the reason that the people of old, they prayed for a man-child was because each lady that got pregnant thought that the Messiah would come from her. So it was not that they didn't want a healthy girl, but they knew that everything went through the man. So she said, Lord, if you give me a man child, I'll give him back to you, and he will serve you all the days of his life. And you know, her son's name was Samuel, and Samuel was the first judge. So when I say Sarah was the most important lady in the Old Testament, that said something, because you got Ruth, you got Sarah, and then you've got Deborah, who was a prophetess. You got Deborah. She judged Israel between Ramoth and between Bethel and Mount Ephraim. Deborah was the one who told Barak when he came to her. She said, look now you a man. You're supposed to be leading the army, and here you come and telling me if you don't go, I don't go. She said, no, I'm going to go with you. She said, but the glory is not going to be given to you, because the glory and the victory is actually going to come through a woman. But Deborah doesn't weigh as more important than Sarah. And then we've got the young pretty girl called Hadassah, who we know as Esther. She was a Jewish queen married to the Persian king. And she saved her people from total annihilation. But yet none of them rises to the importance, Reverend Owens, of Miss Sarah in the Old Testament. In fact, Sarah is equivalent in the Old Testament to the Virgin Mary in the New Testament. Despite her many failures and flaws, watch this now, God changed her name from Sarai, watch this, which means contentious. He changed it to Sarah, which means princess. So Sarah Dyer is a princess. Sarah is listed with the heroes, and Bishop Lockett would say sheroes of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. The Apostle Peter named her as a good example of Christian wives to follow in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, where Peter said, now women, now you all are the daughters of Sarah, so I know you all should know how to behave yourself. He used her to illustrate that. And even the Apostle Paul, he used Sarah to illustrate the grace of God in the life of the believer in Galatians chapter 4, verses 21 through 31. And he used her to relate to us as it relates to being free from the law. He uses Hagar as the bondwoman, and he uses Sarah as the free woman. So he connects her to the life of believers. Now, Sarah, Brian Phillips, is remarkable because she devoted her whole life to Abraham. her whole life to Abraham, giving him her support and encouragement through the good times and the bad times. And what she did is, Deacon Richardson, she wholeheartedly abandoned herself to him so that he could fulfill God's call in his life. Make no mistake about this, my brothers and my sisters. You actually can embrace the God-filled life in a supporting role. Y'all follow me? You can embrace the God-filled life in a supporting role. See, your name don't have to be on the marquee to embrace the God-filled life. You don't have to be the pastor for you to embrace a God-filled life. You don't have to serve as a deacon in order for you to embrace the God-filled life. You don't have to be a trustee. You don't have to be an usher. You don't have to be a Sunday school teacher. No, 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 no. Everybody living can embrace the God-filled life. You don't have to be the HNIC in order for you to embrace the God-filled life. You can do it without nobody knowing your name. You ain't got to be all out front. And you can still embrace the God-filled life. The time has come for Sarah to go the way of all the earth. Verse 1 tells us, Raquel, that she is 107 and 20 years old. Now, this is the only woman in the Bible that the Bible puts a number on. Maybe that's why they don't tell you their age, because they follow in the scriptures. This is the only woman, which highlights her importance, that God actually took time out to tell us how old she was. And she was 127 years old, but if you keep reading and if you know anything about the background, she was 127, but she looked 17 the day she died. God restored this lady's beauty. And one of the reasons God restored the beauty, once again, is because even though it was her husband that God called, she gave everything over to him so that he could embrace the God-filled life. So what God did was bless Sarah because she wasn't a stumbling block. She was a help to Sarah. And that's why some of us, I ain't trying to go after nobody, that's why you're 17 years old and you look like you've been rolled hard and put away wet because you're living raggedy. It ain't your age, it's your actions that's making you look like Dirty Sally on the Big Valley. Once you live right, God does something to you. You see folk now 20, they look 70, like all old and humpback and got an ARP car. Like, how old are you? See, when you live right, you look good. When you live wrong, you look like you live wrong. Some folks are rusty lotion though. You need mink oil, Crisco. Believe me, y'all young folk who want to look old, no, you don't. Wait. And if you live right, God will take care of you. The text tells us, Ajira, that she died. Can you imagine what was running through Abraham's mind? Remember, folks, the Hebrew culture, they married between the ages of 13 and 15. They were much more mature than us. So if they got married when they was 13 and 15, and Sarah is 127, these folk done been together for a century. Yeah. So Sarah, the princess, is at his side for over 120 years. Now the text says Sarah died. We might not know what was running through Abraham's mind, but what Abraham did do, thank God, Reverend Owens, he illustrated for us three things that we need to do while embracing the God-filled life when there is the death or the separation of a loved one. All right? The first thing that Abraham illustrates and teaches us is right there in verse 2, my first point. The first thing we need to do while embracing the God-filled life when there's a death or a separation, because that's all death is a separation of a relationship. Number one, we need to mourn for the dead. Not we should, not it's a good idea. No, you need to mourn.